During the Cold War, rumors circulated that the Central Intelligence Agency had employed and bribed journalists to spread American anti-communist propaganda. Conspiracy theories erupted over the media's pro-CIA stance. And in a shocking twist, it emerged that these theories were not only true, but also that the extent of the CIA's interference was far greater than ever imagined. In the late 1940s, the CIA launched a secret operation under the codename Mockingbird. This operation employed a staggering 3,000 reporters contracted to spread falsified information around the world. These revelations irreparably shattered public trust in mass media. What led the CIA to carry out such mistrustful behavior? And if the CIA has infiltrated the media before, what's to say that it won't happen again? In 1964, journalists David Wise and Thomas Ross wrote a book called Invisible Government, which details the CIA's international mistakes, like the Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961. At the Bay of Pigs, a miscalculated and ill-supported invasion of Cuba led to the deaths of 114 CIA-trained fighters. Angered by its portrayal as an incompetent institution, the agency considered buying every single copy of the book, but this plan was scuppered when the publisher said they would simply print a second edition. Wise and Ross's controversial book ignited suspicions that the CIA was interfering with news output. What followed was a 25,000-word article written by Carl Bernstein for Rolling Stone magazine, which discussed the CIA's role in the media. Bernstein's article outed journalists suspected of being involved in Operation Mockingbird. Eventually, accusations reached a level that the American Congress couldn't ignore. In 1975, an investigation led by Senator Frank Church found absolute proof that the CIA had attempted to influence opinion through the use of covert propaganda, with many journalists confessing to their participation. The extent of the CIA's influence over the media was truly shocking. By 1953, the agency effectively had control over 25 newspapers and radio stations, including the New York Times, CBS, The Washington Post, and NBC. Thomas Braden, the head of the CIA International Organizations Division at the time, released a statement discussing the unlimited funds and capabilities of Operation Mockingbird. He said, "There is no limit to the activities it could decide where necessary to conduct the war, the secret war." The vast multinational scope of the operation certainly supports Braden's statement. Newspaper editor Udo Ulfkott admits that he was employed to spread American anti-communist propaganda in Germany, stating, "I was bribed by the Americans to report not exactly the truth." This covert operation was especially active when the United States controversially deposed Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz in 1954. The media censored publications that were too sympathetic towards Arbenz and prevented left-wing journalists from traveling to the country. CIA interference even spilled over into the film industry. The 1954 adaptation of George Orwell's Animal Farm was funded by the agency, in the hope that the film's critical stance on communism would help further America's Cold War goals. There is very little doubt that Operation Mockingbird took place, but one question that remains is whether or not the CIA's actions were morally right. The Cold War was a conflict of nerve, strategy, and reputation. It was therefore essential that the United States convinced both its own population and external powers that it had the psychological edge over its Soviet adversary. But did this make Operation Mockingbird a necessary mission? Joseph Alsop, a columnist who undertook clandestine tasks for the CIA, said he was proud to have performed work that he considered to be his duty. But not everyone agrees with Alsop. By manipulating what information the public received, the CIA was effectively removing the population's ability to make decisions independently of their government. What's more, the implications of Operation Mockingbird can still be felt today. In 1972, before suspicions of CIA involvement were confirmed, a Gallup poll found that 68% of Americans claimed to trust the media. Today, that number has dropped to 40%. Senator Frank Church's investigation discovered that the bribes and salaries paid to various media outlets cost the American taxpayer an estimated $265 million a year. In February 1976, the CIA released a statement saying that in the future it would not enter into any paid or contract relationship with media outlets. However, they would welcome journalists who wished to cooperate on a voluntary, unpaid basis. This means that the media could still be spreading government-adapted material, protected by the technicality that reporters are not officially working for the agency. German editor Ulfkott has confessed that he has worked under this non-official cover since Operation Mockingbird was stopped. Today, the CIA still has the funding and the means to determine what information the public receives. So it is entirely plausible that, even now, the agency has not entirely relinquished control over the media.
In this episode, we'll be quizzing you on the most infamous drug dealer of our time.
Hey guys and gals, my name's Jason Bond, founder of JasonBondPicks.com, where I teach people just like you how to trade stocks. Now I wasn't
10 huge government cover-ups that really happened. Number 10. Churchill's UFO. During World War II, an RAF plane returning from a mission in Europe encountered a UFO. The incident has never been explained. That is partly because Prime Minister Winston Churchill personally ordered it to be classified and banned all reports on it for 50 years. He was worried it would cause mass panic and undermine people's religious beliefs. Churchill even met with President Dwight Eisenhower to discuss UFO sightings. He also urged an investigation into UFO sightings in 1952. In 2017, researchers uncovered an article he wrote in the late 50s. In it, Churchill argues that we are not alone in the universe. Number 9. The Lennon Files. In the run-up to the 1972 presidential election, Richard Nixon was especially paranoid about losing the youth vote. At the same time, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was constantly worried about the corruption of the young. Both men felt particularly threatened by the influence of rock star John Lennon. Lennon launched his post-Beatles career by moving to America and recording very politicized songs that called for peace and change. Fearing his anti-Vietnam, anti-government stance, Nixon and Hoover ordered Lennon to leave the country within 60 days. When his lawyers got the deadline extended, Nixon served him a new notice. This went on for 2 years. All the while, the FBI kept files on Lennon, trying to use his drug habits as an excuse to deport him. The harassment only stopped after Hoover died and Nixon resigned. Even then, the files were kept secret for over a decade until Professor John Wiener made a Freedom of Information request for them. The FBI fought the request for 14 years until the Supreme Court finally ordered their release in the year 2000. Number 8. The Lost Cosmonaut. Throughout the 1960s, it looked like Russia was winning the space race. Not only did they put the first man into space, they also didn't suffer any disasters like the Apollo 1 fire, which claimed the lives of 3 American astronauts. That is, until 1986, when Russia finally confirmed the death of Valentin Bondarenko. He burned to death in a training accident in 1961. His death was never published by the Soviets, who instead airbrushed him out of all official photos and suppressed all footage of him with other cosmonauts. Sadly, Valentin wasn't the only cosmonaut to be removed from history. At least 5 were removed from documentary and visual records of the space program, whether because they were fired, quit, or failed tragically, like Bondarenko. Number 7. The Pentagon Papers. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara was the man tasked with overseeing America's war in Vietnam. In 1967, he ordered a secret report on the history of American military involvement with Vietnam since 1945. It came to 7,000 pages in 47 volumes. The report revealed that the real goal of the war was not to preserve South Vietnam's independence from the North, but to contain China. It also exposed the US's role in both helping President Diem into power and in allowing the coup against him that led to full-scale war. Lastly, it revealed how America had secretly expanded its bombing campaigns into Laos and Cambodia. When analyst Daniel Ellsberg leaked the report in 1971, he was charged with espionage and theft of government property by the Nixon administration. Nixon's agents also bugged Ellsberg's home and burgled confidential files from his psychiatrist. The president also put injunctions on the New York Times and the Washington Post for trying to publish the report. The full Pentagon Papers weren't published until 2011. Number 6. The My Lai Massacre. The Vietnam War produced some of America's darkest secrets. Chief among these was the My Lai Massacre of 1968. Up to 504 unarmed civilians were murdered by American soldiers. Men, women, and children were all targeted. Some of the women were gang-raped and mutilated. The army claimed the massacre was actually a military victory against enemy forces. They said only 20 civilians died in the chaos of battle. The few soldiers who tried to expose the massacre were shunned and discredited by the army and Congress. When a reporter finally broke the story nearly 2 years later, the army launched an official review. It blamed the massacre on 4 officers who had died since My Lai. Eventually, 26 soldiers were court-martialed for the massacre and the cover-up, but only 1 was convicted. President Nixon commuted his prison sentence to house arrest. He served 3.5 years of his initial life sentence. Number 5. The Roswell Incident. This is perhaps the most famous UFO incident in history. It began as a local news report that a flying saucer crashed in the New Mexico desert near the town of Roswell in summer 1947. The military quickly suppressed the story, claiming it was actually a weather balloon. They even staged photographs of the balloon debris they said was found at the crash site. This cover-up worked for 3 decades, until UFO researchers dug into it. Eventually, the Air Force launched an inquiry which, between 1994 and 1997, concluded that the military had lied. The inquiry said a top-secret high-altitude sensor had crashed to Earth, neither a weather balloon nor a flying saucer. Number 4. Bloody Sunday. In January 1972, an unarmed protest took place in Derry, Northern Ireland. Protesting had just been banned by the government, and British paratroopers were sent to stop the march. They shot 26 protesters, 14 of whom died. A rushed government inquiry exonerated the soldiers, who claimed they acted in self-defense. But the bodies of the dead protesters had no weapons on them. Many of them were shot in the back. Nonetheless, several soldiers were decorated for their actions on the day. An MP who witnessed the killings was blocked from speaking about them in Parliament. 25 years later, a second inquiry into Bloody Sunday began. The Ministry of Defense refused to let investigators see helicopter footage and over 1,000 military photographs of the event. It also claimed all the guns fired on the day had been destroyed. Several of them were later found in various different places. After 13 years, the inquiry finally reported that the army had unjustifiably shot at and murdered the 14 protesters. Number 3. The Watergate Scandal. Richard Nixon's reputation for paranoia was cemented by the scandal that forced him out of the White House. In 1972, Nixon used a secret fund controlled by the Republican Attorney General to wiretap and undermine the Democrats' presidential election campaign. The crimes were exposed when burglars were caught planting bugs in the Democrat Party's headquarters in the Watergate complex in Washington. Nixon told the CIA to stop the FBI's investigation into the scandal. Unfortunately for Nixon, he had installed a tape recording system in the Oval Office, which recorded him ordering the cover-up. When the tapes were subpoenaed by investigators, Nixon refused to turn them over and fired the prosecutor who issued the subpoena. Eventually, the Supreme Court forced Nixon to release the tapes. Nixon resigned before he could be impeached, just halfway through his second term after his landslide re-election victory.
Judicial Watch is in court right now, fighting for honest and clean elections.
Number 2. The Dreyfus Affair. In 1894, the French army was dominated by Catholics and rife with anti-Semitism. When they discovered someone was passing military secrets to Germany, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jew, was secretly arrested and illegally interrogated. He was then charged with treason and tried in a secret military tribunal in which he was not allowed to know the evidence against him. He was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment on Devil's Island. Then, France's head of counter-espionage, Georges Picquart, found evidence that Dreyfus was innocent, and the real traitor was a Catholic officer called Ferdinand Esterhazy. In a 2-day trial, the military found Esterhazy not guilty and allowed him to flee the country. The army then arrested Picquart and accused him of forging evidence against Esterhazy. The writer Émile Zola then publicly accused the army of a cover-up. In response, the government sent him to prison. Eventually, the army was forced to retry Dreyfus in 1899, after he'd spent 5 years in prison. They found him guilty again, and sentenced him to 10 more years on Devil's Island. However, they made Dreyfus an offer. If he admitted he was guilty, he would be pardoned. He agreed. Dreyfus was later proved innocent and reinstated to the army. Number 1. The Iran-Contra Affair. In the 1980s, it was illegal to sell arms to Iran. Congress also prohibited the US government funding anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua. In 1985, President Ronald Reagan famously made it clear that America does not negotiate with terrorists. Then, in November 1986, it emerged Reagan's government made a deal to secure the release of American hostages being held by Hezbollah terrorists. The deal involved selling missiles to Iran in exchange for the hostages. The CIA then used the millions of dollars in profits to fund Nicaraguan rebels, who are known as Contras. Next, the White House and the CIA destroyed documents and refused to declassify crucial files needed by investigators. The lack of evidence prevented charges being brought against suspects. Ultimately, the Secretary of Defense, the NSA director, and 10 others were indicted over the scandal, but they were all either granted immunity or pardoned by President George H.W. Bush. The former vice president claimed he was kept out of the loop during the whole affair, but his diaries suggest he knew the whole story. Reagan denied knowing about the affair. Nevertheless, he accepted responsibility and apologized for the scandal. Evidence now suggests he did order the CIA to fund the Contras and to release the hostages, but it is unclear whether he knew how they did it until the scandal broke.